And we're back with the last of 3 videos looking at the latest wave of B&M exclusive Doctor Who figures from Character Options. And this time it is of course the first Doctor with electronic TARDIS. And if this figure looks familiar, well, we did get a first Doctor with TARDIS B&M exclusive around about this time last year. But there are some subtle differences this time around, most noticeably of course this TARDIS is electronic, and you may notice that the likeness of this First Doctor is a slightly different version of the First Doctor because it is the First Doctor as played by David Bradley as opposed to William Hartnell. Now, if you're not a Doctor Who fan, I appreciate all of that intro must have sounded pretty strange, but bear with me. Let's start off with the packaging. First of all, you may notice that this is kind of similar to what we've seen in the past, but it's a little bit different in that it's a little bit shrunken down. It's a lot smaller and more compact than the previous release. From a storage space point of view, this is a good thing. It's much smaller, easier to store, which is great. But from a presentation point of view, it's a lot worse because what we used to have is a large window display made from plastic and it looked pretty nice all in all. Here we've got a much more truncated space, so things are a little bit more squashed. We can see the TARDIS and of course the Doctor just shoehorned in front of it there, which doesn't look as good. But worse is that they've got rid of the plastic front there, so you could actually poke your finger right the way through this. This gives the case a little bit of a flimsy feel. It's not very solid, and I could see this getting damaged quite easily. And plus, it also means that your figure and your TARDIS is going to get quite dusty if you put it on display, and it's going to be more prone to damage generally. So that's disappointing. I'm assuming that this is a cost-saving exercise to make these figures as affordable as they are. This TARDIS retails at about £25, which is pretty good price considering that it has electronic lights and sounds. But clearly, part of the compromise is the general aesthetic of the packaging. If you're a fan of packaging, this is going to be disheartening. And also, the other thing that they've stripped out, of course, is the interior inlay as well, which used to be part of the presentation, a sort of mini diorama, which was really fun. If you want a good example of that, check out the second Doctor in TARDIS set from the Abominable Snowman from a few years ago. That was absolutely fantastic and a really nice presentation. On the reverse of the packaging, we have a little bit of bio here about this set, and interestingly, most of this information refers to the setup to Doctor Who, the pilot episode, An Unearthly Child, which is kind of interesting because this really isn't from that, but then it's not really apparent whether this is specifically from An Adventure in Time and Space, the docudrama from their 50th anniversary, which starred David Bradley, or if it ties into Twice Upon a Time, which was an actual Doctor Who episode. It was Peter Capaldi's final story, in fact. Anyway, I digress. Overall, this is quite nicely presented. It's quite nice to have this information. I do appreciate these little text boxes that they put on their casing, which is really good. In terms of the overall look and aesthetic, it's not a bad design. It's quite nice having the TARDIS design in there. It's just not very colourful, and I've complained about this on many videos, so I won't go on about it here, but I wish they would have shaken this branding up a little bit, just to make it a bit more colourful and a bit more fun. Now, looking at the First Doctor figure, this is going to be very familiar to those who picked up the very similar set from last year because it is the exact same costume and outfit. The paint apps though are a little bit different, and of course the most significant change is this brand new head sculpt. This is meant to represent the likeness of David Bradley when he was playing the First Doctor. Now, I don't think this is a bad likeness, but it is quite soft, and to be honest, if I didn't know it was meant to be David Bradley, then this could very easily pass for William Hartnell. Now, in a strange meta kind of way, that's exactly what they're going for when David Bradley is playing the First Doctor. He's meant to be playing William Hartnell as the First Doctor, so maybe that's actually a real credit to the story and to the actor, but at the same time it just feels a little bit soft. I think there's a lot more detail, a lot more cragginess that they could have pulled out of David Bradley's likeness into this sculpt that would have made this more distinctively his version of the First Doctor, but that might just be me. If we compare this version of the figure to last year's release, we can really see the striking difference between these two sculpts. On the right hand side we have the William Hartnell sculpt that was released last year, and on the left hand side of course we have the David Bradley sculpt. So you can really see they've created a brand new sculpt here, and it is meant to be a distinctively different Doctor. This is just a much younger looking version of the First Doctor, I suppose. Of the two, I would probably say I prefer the William Hartnell version, A, because he is the First Doctor, and B, because I think there's a lot more detailing, there's nicer paint apps. I think it's just a much better sculpt all round. The rest of the figure, as you can see here, is exactly the same mould, so it's the same body, and it even has the same scarf. The only thing that's very different, of course, is the colouring for this scarf, and I think they've done a very nice job of this, actually. I always appreciate a little splash of colour on my action figures, and no more so, actually, than on the black and white characters, as a splash of colour really brings them to life, and this is how they would have been dressed in the actual show on set, and it was surprisingly colourful. We think so much of the 60s Doctor Who's being black and white, and obviously in very monotone kind of colours, but when you look at set photos from the time, you realise just how colourful this show was. You only have to look at the TARDIS, which is a bright and brilliant lime green, to give you an indication of just how colourful this world was on set. There's nothing particularly new about the legs. Obviously, they've opted for a more muted colour tone this time. Previously, they did have a sort of brown checkered pants. This time, they've gone for the grey instead. In terms of articulation, well, we know what to expect here. There is a swivel at the head, and you can turn the head from side to side, but it is a little bit restricted by that scarf. There's a single swivel at the shoulder, so the arms will lift up and down. Sadly, there is no hinge there, which is a real shame. It does have a bicep swivel, though, which is kind of good. It gives you a bit more range of motion, but it tends to look a little bit ugly if you put it out like this. There is a single joint at the elbow, of course, and then we do have another swivel at the wrist, so that wrist will rotate 360 degrees, although you will find yourself fighting the cuff a little bit. Now, I think there is articulation at the waist, but you're not really going to be able to get an awful lot out of this because it is trapped behind that plastic coat there, so this is not the best for that. Now, he does have a hinge at the hip, so he can kick his legs out a little bit, again restricted by the coat, but he does have an upper thigh swivel, which is pretty cool, and despite the coat, he can get his legs out a little bit if you persevere, which isn't bad. There's another single joint at the knee, of course, and that is it. Moving on to the TARDIS, of course, this is the same mould as we saw in the previous release. However, there is significant changes when it comes to the paint application. This is a much brighter blue. Again, this ties into the props that were used on set and the brilliant colours that they used on set that they had to compensate because they were filming in black and white. So for me personally, I really like the brighter colours. On my TARDIS, I always love a brighter shade of blue, but obviously this will depend on personal preference, what you actually prefer. But one of the nice things that's running through this is a sort of white wash that appears here and there, which again gives it a little bit of texture and depth, which is pretty nice. If you've never owned one of these TARDISes before, you'll be pleased to know that the doors actually do open, they're functional, and you can stand your first Doctor in there, which is pretty cool. You can close the doors with him inside, and there's probably enough room to hold two figures actually, which is pretty nice, although it will be pretty snug. There's also an action feature here. If we look at the floor panel, we can see there's this little square here. If we press that, that will flick a switch that closes the door, which is pretty cool. And since I compared the two first Doctors, let's compare both TARDISes as well. And as you can see, of course, they are the same sculpt, they are the same mould, but we can see the huge difference in the paint application here. Obviously, the first release here on the right is all pretty much one shade of a really dark blue. There's not much in the way of paint wash running through it to give it any extra depth or texture, whereas in this new release on the left, of course, we can see two tones. We can see the brighter blue for the majority of the TARDIS, and then the base has this darker blue, which is pretty cool, and as I said, it has those whitewashed tones as well, which is pretty nice. And for the sake of scale, here it is next to the Monster of Peladon TARDIS that was released a couple of years back. This wasn't an electronic TARDIS, but as you can see, it's obviously a slightly different shape, it's a lot smaller, and is a much brighter powder blue. I have to say, for my money, this is probably my favourite of the classic TARDISes so far. On the base there is a switch to turn on the electronics, and you'll notice there is this little button here, so when you push down on this, it does activate the electronic sound. you can see, the TARDIS lamp also lights up, which is brilliant. And I really like that this light effect continues after the TARDIS has been warping. And of course we have two warping effects upon landing and takeoff, which is really very, very cool. So I have to say, this is a really nice set. Now, I'm a sucker when it comes to the electronic lights and sounds in toys generally, and I particularly love it in my TARDIS. So it's always special when one of these gets a special release, and it's nice to see this in a budget line that's quite affordable. So this is a nice release. If you haven't had a First Doctor and TARDIS before, you're probably going to want to rush out and pick this one up. If you already picked up the previous release and you already have a classic TARDIS with the lights and sound, then this might be a harder sell for you, and I think it will ultimately come down to how much you like David Bradley's interpretation of the Doctor, and do you want a specific version of that character. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.